Have you ever caught yourself doing something you swore you never would? That moment of dissonance when you realize you've crossed a personal line you once thought uncrossable? Perhaps it was small, a lie that slipped too easily from your lips, or silence when you should have spoken. Now imagine that line crossing magnified 100-fold. History reveals an unsettling pattern. Ordinary individuals, neighbors, colleagues, even family members, transforming into perpetrators of shocking cruelty. This transformation isn't limited to distant historical atrocities. It happens in boardrooms, schools, online communities, and homes every day. The distance between moral integrity and moral collapse may be far shorter than we care to admit. The most disturbing aspect of human darkness isn't that monsters exist, it's that they're made, not born. Through subtle psychological processes, environmental pressures, and unconscious forces, the human mind can rationalize almost any action, no matter how horrific. Understanding this process isn't just academic curiosity. It's a mirror reflecting our own vulnerability and revealing our capacity for both extraordinary compassion and unfathomable cruelty. While the Stanford prison experiment has become the poster child for explaining how good people turn bad, behavioral economist Dan Ariely's less famous but equally revealing research demonstrates how dishonesty works like a contagion. In his fudge factor experiments, Ariely discovered that cheating isn't primarily driven by cost-benefit analysis, but by our remarkable ability to reframe unethical behavior. When participants could take money without directly stealing, by simply taking tokens that could be exchanged for money, cheating increased dramatically. The psychological distance between action and consequence allowed people to maintain their self-image as honest while still acting dishonestly. Even more troubling, when participants witnessed someone from their in-group cheating, their own dishonesty increased significantly, suggesting moral corruption spreads through social networks like a virus. This phenomenon extends beyond laboratories. Consider how corporate fraud typically unfolds. It rarely begins with outright theft. Instead, it starts with creative accounting, small adjustments that technically comply with rules while violating their spirit. Over time, these minor infractions normalize, boundaries shift, and behavior that once triggered moral alarm becomes routine. Former executives at companies like Enron describe this incremental descent, with each step seeming justifiable in isolation, while collectively leading to catastrophic ethical failures. The warning here is clear. Moral corruption rarely happens in dramatic leaps. It occurs through small steps that slowly desensitize our ethical alarm system. Our susceptibility to situational pressures reveals uncomfortable truths about human nature. Social psychologist Solomon Asch's conformity experiments demonstrated that roughly 1/3 of people will deny objective reality, claiming a shorter line is longer, simply to align with group consensus. When uncertainty increases, this conformity skyrockets. This helps explain why normally compassionate people participate in workplace bullying, remain silent during unethical corporate decisions, or join in collective harassment online. The desire to belong often trumps individual moral judgment. But conformity is only one piece of the puzzle. Something more fundamental occurs when we surrender moral responsibility to authorities or systems. Hannah Arendt's concept of the banality of evil, developed while observing Nazi officer Adolf Eichmann's trial, suggests that extraordinary evil often emerges not from exceptional hatred, but from ordinary obedience and bureaucratic detachment. Eichmann described himself not as an anti-Semite, but as a dutiful civil servant, following orders and doing his job. His evil stemmed not from sadism, but from surrendering personal judgment to organizational hierarchy, a psychological mechanism available to virtually anyone. This abdication of responsibility appears in everyday settings whenever we say, "I'm just following protocol," or "that's above my pay grade." These phrases signal the dangerous territory where personal ethics become subordinate to institutional demands. In healthcare settings, researchers have documented cases where nurses administered clearly incorrect medication dosages because a doctor ordered them, despite their own concerns. The institutional hierarchy outweighed their medical judgment, a pattern that has cost patients' lives. Beyond authority and conformity, lies a third pathway to moral corruption: identity and role adoption. When we strongly identify with a role, parent, soldier, team member, partisan, our behavior shifts to match role expectations, sometimes overriding personal moral standards. In one revealing study, parents who strongly identified with their role as protective provider were more likely to act dishonestly to benefit their children than those with equal love but less role identification. Their moral flexibility wasn't driven by affection, but by identity. This is what good parents do. This identity-based moral flexibility explains why ethical people can engage in unethical behavior during conflicts between groups. When strongly identified with a religious, political, or national identity, otherwise compassionate individuals can justify harming outgroup members as necessary for protecting what they hold sacred. The violence isn't driven by hatred, but by love for one's own group, values, or way of life. This transformation of love into cruelty through identity represents perhaps the most insidious path to moral corruption, because it feels virtuous from within while appearing monstrous from without. But perhaps the most fundamental mechanism enabling moral corruption is our capacity for dehumanization, seeing others as less than fully human. Neuroscientific research using fMRI technology reveals something chilling. When viewing images of certain outgroups, particularly homeless people and drug addicts in Western contexts, the medial prefrontal cortex, the brain region associated with social cognition and empathy, shows significantly reduced activation compared to viewing other humans. Essentially, the brain processes these individuals more like objects than people. This neural deactivation correlates with reduced helping behavior and increased willingness to inflict harm. Dehumanization operates through language, propaganda, and framing that strips people of their individuality and complexity. Terms like illegals, thugs, or vermin serve not just as insults, but as cognitive shortcuts that bypass empathy. Digital communication accelerates this process. Reducing complex humans to profile pictures and comment threads enables dehumanization with unprecedented efficiency. Notice how quickly online disagreements escalate to dehumanizing language compared to face-to-face interactions. The screen creates distance that disables moral restraint. What makes these mechanisms particularly dangerous is their invisibility. We rarely recognize when we're dehumanizing others, surrendering to authority, or shifting our moral boundaries. These processes operate beneath conscious awareness, protected by an extensive architecture of self-deception. Psychologist Albert Bandura identified several mechanisms of moral disengagement that allow good people to do harmful things while maintaining a positive self-image. Moral justification transforms harmful actions into necessary or righteous ones. This harsh treatment serves a greater purpose. Euphemistic language sanitizes cruelty, enhanced interrogation instead of torture. Advantageous comparison makes actions seem benign compared to alternatives. We're not as bad as them. Displacement of responsibility shifts blame to authorities. I'm just following orders. Diffusion of responsibility distributes blame across a group. Everyone is doing it. Disregarding consequences minimizes harm. They'll get over it. Attribution of blame places responsibility on victims. They brought this on themselves. These mechanisms help explain why ordinarily ethical individuals can participate in workplace harassment, discriminatory practices, or systems that harm vulnerable populations while considering themselves good people. They're not simply bad apples, but ordinary humans using psychological tools available to everyone. The hopeful aspect of this understanding is that awareness creates choice. By recognizing our vulnerability to these forces, we gain power to resist them. This begins with ethical foresight, anticipating situations that might compromise our values before we're immersed in them. Research shows that people who pre-commit to ethical actions before facing temptation are significantly more likely to maintain integrity than those who rely on in-the-moment willpower. Consider developing a personal ethical code that functions independently of external authorities and group expectations. Questions like, would I be comfortable if my actions were publicly known? Or, would I want my child to behave this way? can bypass rationalization mechanisms that enable moral corruption. More powerful still is embracing radical empathy, deliberately seeking to understand the full humanity of those we might otherwise dehumanize. This explains why diverse organizations typically demonstrate stronger ethical performance. Working alongside diverse colleagues makes dehumanization more difficult. Organizational psychologist Adam Grant emphasizes the importance of distinguishing your values from your goals. Values represent who you are. Goals represent what you want to achieve. When these conflict, prioritizing values over goals provides a compass for navigating ethically complex situations. This distinction matters because most moral failures occur when people sacrifice values for goals, truth for advancement, fairness for efficiency, kindness for winning. Another powerful protective strategy involves creating psychological distance from immediate pressures. Research shows that people make more ethical decisions when considering situations in third person, what should they do, rather than first-person terms, what should I do? This shift in perspective activates moral reasoning rather than self-interested justification. Similarly, imagining how you'll feel about a decision in the future, particularly how it might affect your legacy and relationships, can overcome immediate pressures that enable moral compromise. Developing practical wisdom, the ability to recognize ethical dimensions of everyday situations, requires deliberate practice. This means reflecting on ethical challenges after they have passed, seeking feedback from trusted others, and studying moral exemplars who maintained integrity in challenging circumstances. Historical figures like Raoul Wallenberg, who saved thousands of Hungarian Jews during the Holocaust while serving as a Swedish diplomat, demonstrate how individuals can resist systemic evil from within systems, using their position creatively rather than surrendering moral agency. But perhaps the most fundamental protection against moral corruption stems from genuine self-knowledge. The Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung suggested that those who remain unconscious of their shadow side, the capacity for cruelty, selfishness, and harm that exists in everyone, are most vulnerable to its influence. By acknowledging our capacity for wrongdoing, we paradoxically gain power to choose right action. This awareness isn't pessimistic. It's realistic about human complexity and ultimately empowering. The most profound truth about moral transformation works in both directions. The same psychological processes that enable corruption can, when consciously directed, facilitate extraordinary goodness. Group identity can motivate sacrifice for others. Authority can organize collective action toward noble ends. Our capacity for role adoption allows us to transcend self-interest for professional ethics. The key difference lies in consciousness, whether these forces operate on autopilot or under our deliberate guidance. This understanding carries implications for building ethical communities and organizations. Rather than relying solely on rules and punishment, lasting ethical cultures emerge from social norms, thoughtful leadership, and systems that acknowledge human psychology. Ethical leaders create psychological safety for dissent, reward integrity even when inconvenient, and treat ethics as a continuous conversation rather than a compliance checklist. They recognize that organizational integrity doesn't develop through mission statements, but through how everyday decisions are made, especially under pressure. The philosopher Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who survived Soviet labor camps, wrote, "The line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being." This insight isn't just poetic, it's psychologically precise. We all contain the capacity for both extraordinary compassion and shocking cruelty. This understanding should inspire neither cynicism nor despair, but rather vigilance and commitment to conscious ethical development. Each day presents choices that shape not just our actions, but who we become. The path toward ethical integrity isn't completed, but continually chosen, often in seemingly insignificant moments that collectively define us. By understanding the psychological pathways that lead good people toward harm, we gain the power to consciously choose different paths toward compassion, integrity, and moral courage. The question isn't whether you contain the capacity for both darkness and light. You do. The question is which capacity you'll nurture through awareness, practice, and the communities you build. Every ethical choice, no matter how small, represents a vote for the kind of person you're becoming and the world you're helping to create. In your next ethical crossroads, will you act on autopilot or with conscious choice? The difference may seem subtle, but across a life and multiplied across communities, it changes everything. Thank you for watching. If this topic resonates with you, please share your experience in the comments below. And remember to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss upcoming videos on depth psychology.